Hello everyone, and welcome to another reflection upon the commands of Christ. We're looking at these commands as part of our larger series called True Love, Fact and Fiction. We believe that these commands of Christ, they help us to raise our love game to another level. They teach us about the meaning of God's love, the power of God's love to change us, to change the way we see other people, to change the way we treat other people. And so far we've been looking at a section of the scripture known as the Sermon on the Mount. It's where Jesus gathers his disciples around this hillside near Capernaum and unveils his kingdom and what that kingdom is all about. And part of that is an extension of the law that was already given to the people of God under the lawgiver Moses. He's citing the examples of Old Testament law and showing how his kingdom builds upon that foundation, but takes it even further. And what we've learned over the first couple days of reflection is that Jesus is concerned not just with the action, the outcome, what the law prohibits in terms of action. He's going to the source, how we think, how we feel, what's at the center of our actions, what causes our actions. And he's saying that we have to get to that level of cause in order to prevent the deed itself. So we looked, for example, at the deed of murder, and he's saying behind murder, there is the problem of anger and the problem of dismissing people, calling them names, disregarding them as children of God. And now we want to continue that theme by looking at another juxtaposition between an outward act and the inward cause, and how God's righteousness needs to get to that inward cause in order to prevent the outward deed. So we look then at Matthew chapter 5, and we begin in verse 27. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" This was part of the law of Moses, the seventh command in the 10 Commandments. There are many other laws throughout the law of Moses that dealt with this subject of adultery. Just as in our culture, adultery was a problematic reality in their culture. When someone makes a promise to somebody else to be faithful and then engages in sexual activity with someone else, it creates all sorts of problems, relationship problems, society problems, family problems, cultural problems. This was all replete in that culture and in ours. In that day, adultery was taken very seriously. In the law of Moses, there were very specific commands that even upon occasion required the death penalty. Obviously, in our culture, things have changed. Adultery is still a problem. People are still dealing with it in their marriages and in their other relationships. It's not illegal in this country, at least not the death penalty. Let me put it this way, the death penalty is not as enforced. I know there is some concerns that in other lands and in other faiths that is still the case, but in this country that is not the case. But still, it's a problem and people are dealing with it. When someone makes a promise to somebody and then engages in sexual activity with another person, it creates a ripple effect of damage, not just in them, but in families and the culture around. So Jesus is saying that's a problem. You know that that's a problem when that act occurs. But again, he wants us to go back to the source and asks what's driving all that. Look at verse 28. Jesus says, "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." He deals with the man here, the man being the problem. Of course, adultery can be initiated from either side. He uses the man's side here in that culture. And what he's saying here is it begins in the heart. The heart in that culture was seen as the center of our actions. It's where our emotions and our brain come together. We mix it together and we do what comes out of that heart. Sometimes our brain is in charge, sometimes our emotions, our biology is in charge. Whatever it is goes into that equation. It filters through this center he's calling the heart, and that really drives our actions. It's what we really want to do no matter what we say we want to do, no matter what we're pretending. No, the heart is the reality of what drives us into what we do. And he's saying that if lust is the thing driving us, if that's the most powerful thing that drives our actions, then it's going to result in this adultery. So the problem has to do with the heart level. And what he's saying here is it starts with that look. that lustful look at another person. In this case, a man looking at a woman. What happens in that lustful look? Well, we look at that person no longer as a person, no longer as a child of God, but as an object, as a biological object. We have a certain biological imperative in us to procreate. That comes with our biology. And we are looking for someone to couple with, someone to fulfill that biological mandate. And we begin to look at that person simply as a biological object, a sexual object. This is where the problem starts. That's what lust is. Lust is looking at another person as an object, as a sexual object, not as a human being. And this is where Jesus says the problem begins. We're not seeing people as objects. Now, in our culture, there's all kinds of reasons to do that. I mean, we live in a world where sexuality is just a biological act. People are not seen as human beings in that interchange. Pornography, even mainstream media just shows sexual activity as a norm. Whether people are committed or not committed, it's just seen as a biological act. And the problem is that this divides the person. Love is not lust. They're two different things. Love requires seeing the other person as a person. They're not just a body to satisfy our needs. They are a whole person with needs and feelings and thoughts. And the sexual experience in the biblical way of thinking about it is supposed to be a long-term monogamous commitment where we're engaged with somebody physically, but also emotionally and spiritually, so that there's a whole relationship with the whole person. And Jesus is saying that this all goes sideways when we look at another person as an object. And his antidote to that sounds very, very strict. Look at verse 29. He says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And then he continues that line of thinking in verse 30. He says, and if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body again than for your whole body to go to hell. This seems like a very severe addressing of the problem. He's saying that lust starts when we look at another person, we see them as an object. And he's saying you got to go to the source, and you got to take care of this problem at the source. Now, in that culture, and maybe some extent in our culture, most people are right-handed. So the idea of the right eye, the right hand, in a culture that's all about living on the land, and especially if you're into hunting or if you're a warrior or anything like that, the right eye, the right hand seen as the dominant hand. And he's saying if your biology is creating that much of a problem for you spiritually, then you have to deal with it. You have to take care of it at the source. You have to take radical steps. You remember yesterday when we talked about when we find out we've wronged one of our brothers or sisters, or at least they think we've wronged them, we're supposed to leave our altar, our gift at the altar, and go all the way home. Even if we're in Jerusalem at the altar, we've got to go all the way home and make repair. There's that sense of urgency. Jesus is saying the same thing with regard to adultery. There's an urgency here. There's a necessity. We need to deal with it in a radical way. Now, I don't think Jesus is telling us to do this literally. I don't think he's literally asking us to gouge eyes and cut off hands. Some people in the history of the church have thought that, and most notably one thinks of Origen. So apparently, we're told, because of a verse like this, Origen actually goes and castrates himself so he would not be lustful. But I don't think Jesus is really recommending that kind of literal physical mutilation. I'm not sure that anyway that would solve the problem, right? If the problem is in the heart, getting rid of your eye or your hand is not going to solve the problem of the heart. But he is saying that we have to take radical steps to do something so that our mind does not objectify the other person. That may look different in your life. It may look different in everyone's life. I was talking with someone the other day about being in ministry, And a subject come up about other women in ministry and how do you deal with women in ministry. And I said, a long time ago, I made a decision that there's my wife and everybody else is my sister. I try to look at every other woman in my life as my sister, my Christian sister. Not to go down that road to see them at all as a sexual object or as a gendered object, but as a person, as a sister whom I am called to love, that they are God's child. I'm not allowed to mess with God's child. That's his child that he's protecting. It has to do with the frame of reference that we use to look at someone who is that person. For some of us, that may mean changing what we take in. I know that in this culture, I've dealt with many men over the years that the addiction to pornography, that constant pounding of objects on a brain, physically, it just takes your brain to a place where you're unable to really see people as people anymore. You see them all as objects. It just adds to that pressure. And so the antidote then is to cut oneself off. And maybe in your case, if you're dealing with this as an issue, you really do need to cut yourself off from the kind of media that treats people as objects. But this is where we need to get, and there's some sort of urgency there if we're going to fix the problem of love. If we're really going to love someone and help someone, then all those objects that you're looking at, those are people with real needs and real problems and real relational issues. And if we go down that road of looking at them as objects and then we follow up with that with actions, it's going to create all the problems that we now see in our society. So as Christ followers, we're supposed to deal with the problem at the source. We're supposed to look at people and see people, not as objects to satisfy our sexual lusts. So I realize this is a complicated issue. At some other point, we'll talk more about sexuality and marriage and all the cultural, religious aspects of that. But at its root, I think we know what Jesus is saying. That in our heart, in the way we see people, if we can capture it at that level, if we can not even go down that slippery slope to action, we can begin to reflect God's love in a pure, more helpful and healing way in our culture. So let's take seriously this command of Christ. Let's seek to follow it even more closely this week, and I'll see you again tomorrow.